I want to talk about the rise of paganism and the death of religion and the context, the political context in which this is all happening in just a second. But first, just bringing you up to date on some of the news of the day. Maria Butina, or Butina, I've heard it pronounced both ways, the young Russian who went to I believe it was Georgetown. It was someplace in Washington D.C. Got her master's degree. The prosecutors, she's just pled guilty to basically using the NRA and other groups to helping facilitate funneling millions of dollars, presumably, from Russia into the NRA. We don't have all the details on this, and trying to influence the presidential election that way. They have backed off. This from the New York Times. Prosecutors have already been forced to back off the most salacious accusations that she used sex as spycraft, and they acknowledged in court filings this week that she genuinely wanted a graduate degree and not simply posing as a student to live in the U.S. They also dropped accusations of her being in contact with Russian intelligence agencies. So it's looking more and more like this is just let's buy influence with the Republican Party. And whether it's on the part of the government or some billionaire or whatnot, we're still figuring it out, right? We're still putting that together. There's a bunch of other things in the news too, but I want to start out by just revisiting this piece that Russ Douthat, I think is how it's Douthat. He's been on the program, but anyway, he's a columnist for the New York Times, and he wrote this piece on the 12th, yesterday, titled "The Return of Paganism." And really what he's talking about here, I think, I refer to it as James Madison's nightmare, although, I don't think it's a nightmare. Well, here is what Madison had to say. Not verbatim, but just in essence. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson had this running disagreement for about 10 or 15 years. You can find it in their correspondences, particularly their correspondences from from around 1787, 1788, when the Constitution was being written and promoted. Jefferson was in Paris, Madison was in Virginia, and they were corresponding. And Jefferson was arguing that one of the biggest threats to American democracy would be if religious people, that is to say, priests or ministers, became elected officials. He even flirted with the idea of barring them from running for political office, although he concluded that would be, inappropriate, unconstitutional. But, he saw that as a threat to America if somebody like Jerry Falwell became president. James Madison wasn't so concerned about that. He didn't think that the American people were stupid enough to elect a religious leader to a political post. He instead was concerned that if the government ever started giving money to the churches or interfering with the churches in any way, that would destroy Christianity. Now, keep in mind, Jefferson was a deist. He didn't believe the tenets of Christianity. He didn't think that Jesus was divine. He thought he was a brilliant prophet, a brilliant wise elder, but not divine. Whereas James Madison was a Christian. I don't recall if he was a Presbyterian or it was one of those kind of secondary mainline denominations. And Madison's concern about the destruction of Christianity, I think, is exactly what we're looking at, and I think it really started with the Reagan administration. With this outreach from the Reagan-Bush administration to the right-wing Christian communities that was led in part by the Vice President Bush's son, George, who was the outreach director to the right-wing evangelicals for the second half of the Reagan presidency and for all of his father's presidency and his father's 1988 and 1992 presidential campaigns. And what Ross is writing is that institutional Christianity has weakened drastically since the 1960s. He says the people who have, traditionally been sort of the lukewarm Christians, right? The people who go to Christmas and Easter at church, but that's about it. They're now saying that they have no religion, or that they are spiritual but not religious. And he points out the mainline Protestant establishment, the Methodists and Congregationalists and Presbyterians, they're basically, powerless. They've lost a lot of their followers. And it's not that those followers all went to these big mega churches and right-wing evangelical churches. It's that they've simply gone away. Now, one of the stories that explains this is that it's called the secularization story. As societies advance, become wealthier, become more grounded in science rather than superstition, reason rather than religious philosophy, that as that happens, inevitably people are going to drift away from religion, saying, "Oh yeah, well our ancestors believed that stuff about this Bronze Age sky god who had to murder his own son in order to save us because he made a mistake with women or some this strange story of Christianity." But the problem is that the number of Americans who say yes when asked if you've had a profound religious experience or awakening that redirected your life, the percentage of Americans who say yes is about twice what today what it was in 1960. So in 1960, more people were going to church, but fewer of them were describing religious experiences. Today, twice as many people are experiencing or describing religious experiences, but they're not going to church anymore. So the question I'm asking, and that I invite you to call in and discuss with me, is kind of on multiple levels. Number one, to what extent has the right-wingification of Christianity, this merger of church and state that Madison so feared that we saw happen during the Reagan administration, that was pushed on us by the Ralph Reeds and the Jerry Falwells and the George W. Bushes. I mean, he was the liaison between those guys and his daddy. To what extent has the right-wingification of Christianity in the United States led to basically people saying, "Screw that! I don't want to have any part of that. I'm not interested in being part of a political church." To what extent has the Republican Party basically destroyed Christianity in the United States? Number one. Number two, to what extent have you or people in your family or your friends, your sphere of influence, turned away from kind of official churchdom and replaced it with a personal spirituality? I know I have certainly done this. I used to like to go to church occasionally, and I grew up in going to church. My mom was very, very quote religious. My dad was an agnostic, but I didn't know that until he was in the last year of his life. But until he knew it, he was dying, and he just started telling me all these things, But it was an anchor for me. I'd go to church and just kind of feel good. I still do. I mean, sometimes when I'm traveling, if I walk by a church that's open, I'll just go in and sit in the pew and meditate for 10 or 15 minutes. I like it. But I don't go to church anymore. I go to I sit zazen with a bunch of people at a Zen center here in Portland on Sundays. Occasionally, Louise and I do that. And I've got a zafu and a zabudan, a little cushion and pillow in my office at home that I sit and meditate in, often using my Muse headband now. I do that, a couple days a week and then meditate without it most of the time. But it kind of helps recalibrate, it keeps me on track. So I think and I, every morning when I'm walking to work, I'm saying my prayers for the day. So I would say that spirituality has become a bigger part of my life over the last decade than since maybe I was a teenager, when it was a huge part of my life. But I'm not involved with any church. Ross is talking about the fragmentation and personalization of Christianity. And he says, one of the things that are kind of destroying Christianity are the prosperity gospel and Christian nationalism. He says these rule the right, and on the left, it's basically the social gospel. The United Church of Christ, for example, has long had outreach to the gay community and to minority communities. So he says, is it possible that paganism is being revived, and this is the future, essentially, of what today we call Christianity, the future of spirituality in the United States. In fact, he points out there will soon be more witches in the United States, self-avowed witches, than members of the United Church of Christ. Stephen Smith, a law professor at the University of San Diego, wrote a book called Pagans and Christians in the City, Culture Wars from the Tiber to the Potomac. And he says behind the scenes what's actually happening is the return to a pagan religious conception, that divinity is actually in the world, not outside the world. That if you want to find the actual vibrating spirit of all life, open the window and look at the natural world around us, that increasingly we're embracing nature. This was Jefferson's religion. In fact, he wrote it into the Declaration of Independence. He wrote, "Nature's God," in the Declaration of Independence. John Adams scratched it out and wrote the Christian God, and Jefferson scratched that back out again and again wrote in nature's God. And so here you have, nature's God explicitly in the Declaration of Independence. I mean, so are we returning basically to the spirituality that animated and informed the founders? Or are we, or not? It seems to me that we are. I mean, I find God in nature. I mean, my spiritual life is mostly in nature. He says, this sees the purpose of religion and spirituality as more therapeutic, seeking harmony with nature and happiness in the everyday, that every day is divinely endowed and shaped, meaningful and not random, a place where we can truly hope to be at home. That's my sense of it. And I find this just fascinating, and I'm wondering, what you think and what your experience has been. Where do we go with this? And what impact is the increasing politicization of religion having on religion itself? It seems to me that the whole right-wing thing is actually damaging Christianity.